It's 99% sure Tim Scott will be the majority leader of the Senate Banking Committee unless President Trump convinces him to take a political appointee position. But now that Trump has already nominated all his cabinet members, that's highly unlikely. And quite honestly, the Scott people had kind of alluded to me that he wasn't that interested in serving in Trump's cabinet.
Welcome in, everybody. You're listening to Wrestling Payments, a podcast where we help payment professionals contend with the challenges of modernizing their payments operations and identifying ways to build for the future. If you're interested in payments innovation and modernization, you're in the right place. Now, let's get into it.
Hello and welcome to Wrestling Payments. Today's going to be a really great episode. I am always interested in listening to Bill. I have Bill Sullivan here. He's the Associate Managing Director for Government and Communications. Did I get that right?
Government and Industry Relations.
Industry Relations. It was a long title. Sorry. But Bill's a champion to us. He comes to our meetings, our conferences, and really has the lowdown on what's really going on in government, not just the headlines, not just the TikToks. It's what's moving and what has the likelihood of happening, with no guarantees ever given, but that's the way things roll. Bill, I'm just going to tee it off to you. What's going on? We just had an election and lots of things are moving. What do we need to know?
Absolutely, Joe. And it's an honor to be able to use this forum to address NEACH and NEACH's members. So thank you very much before we even start. Okay, we had an election several weeks ago, and the presidential party, the House party, and the Senate party, all in leadership positions, is the Republican Party. So it is a kind of a very rare occurrence in politics that we have all three of those chambers being run by the same political party. So you could argue there's a mandate, but quite honestly, the numbers are so tight, I'm not really sure how strong that mandate is. But one of the things I thought, if we kind of focus in on payments and the policy areas around payments that may be really beneficial to know is there was a chain of events that are going to impact the Senate Banking Committee. I think most of at least the folks that really follow politics are aware that Senator Brown, a long-term senator, a Democrat, lost in Ohio, and Senator Tester, a long-term senator from Montana, lost as well. So those were two of the four seats that kind of kicked control of the Senate to the Republicans. But here's where those two seats really matter. Because the Republicans have taken control of the Senate, they'll be the majority leader for the Senate will be a Republican. So normally Sherrod Brown would be the minority leader of the Senate Banking Committee as he ran the committee when the Democrats were in charge. And if Senator Brown had lost, it would have dropped down to Senator Tester. Senator Tester also lost. So where we stand now is on the Republican side, the last session or the current session that's empty, Tim Scott, who ran for president from South Carolina, was the minority leader of the Senate Banking Committee. It's 99% sure Tim Scott will be the majority leader of the Senate Banking Committee unless President Trump convinces him to take a political appointee position. But now that Trump has already nominated all his cabinet members, that's highly unlikely. And quite honestly, the Scott people had kind of alluded to me that he wasn't that interested in serving in Trump's cabinet. He really thought that his career path was best suited in the Senate. And the one thing you might see him do is he'll take charge of the Senate Banking Committee. He may run the Republicans' efforts to reelect Senate candidates in the 2026-2028 election. So he'll still have sort of a prominent position within the current administration and within Congress, but running the Senate Banking Committee. If for some reason I'm wrong, it would be Senator Mike Rounds would take over Senate Banking. And so that's pretty clean cut. Here's where it gets really interesting. You lost the first two on the Democrats' side. Then the next two after that is Jack Reed of Rhode Island and Senator Mark Warner of my home state, the Commonwealth of Virginia. Both of them are already chairmen of other Senate banking committees. In order to be a chairman, you can only take on one committee. So Jack Reed wants to stick with his committee, and Senator Warner wants to stick as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Mm-hmm. So now we kind of go down the line a little bit. we have got somebody from your neck of the woods who is likely the minority leader, Senator Elizabeth Warren. So the interesting thing here is now you've got Senator Brown, a conservative Southern Republican. You've got Senator Warren, a very powerful, very outspoken, far more to the left than most senators from up north, having to work together on this committee. And most people listening right now are probably rolling their eyes like, well, that's 4 years of nothing happening. Actually 2 years because of the midterms, but we'll get into that later. But I actually think that might be wrong. And this is where, people are going to go like, Joe, you got an idiot who's doing this talking. I think that your common accord between Senator Warren and Senator Scott is going to be housing issues, where they both are fairly passionate about it. Coming from South Carolina, Senator Scott knows how difficult it is for home ownership, for people living paycheck to paycheck with rent. And it's always been a pet project for Senator Warren. So if you think about like a political circle where, you've got Scott here kind of going to the right and Warren here going to the left, I think they may find a way just to walk next door to each other and connect. I also think the other one, because it is such a great need, and I think because of some of the other efforts that Congress may undertake, is anti-money laundering. I think that they'll both see the need for legislation and figure out a way to work together on that. I'm sure Senator Warren will probably want to go with more stringent than Senator Scott, but I think they'll find a way to get there. And one of the reasons why I think that is so important is the appointees that can actually impact the payments industry and the President of the United States have a strong kind of love affair currently with the crypto industry. And I think we could see, I don't honestly think we're going to see legislation pass in 2 years, but I think we're going to see a continuation of all the education hearings and all the fact-finding hearings that both the House and Senate have done on all things crypto, digital wallets, stablecoin, CBDC, et cetera. And I think with that, the money laundering issues will have to also take center stage. And I'm going to come back to the crypto in a little bit when we start talking more about the president and his administration. But I also will point out that a more junior but very powerful committee of the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Lummis of Wyoming, has a stablecoin bill ready to go in the next Congress. That stablecoin bill had bipartisan support in this last Congress, and it was very similar to a bipartisan support bill that the House Financial Services Committee had that was authored by Congressman McHenry, a Republican who retired, who was the leader of the Senate House Financial Services Committee, but also had the blessing of Maxine Waters, the minority ranking member of House Financial Services. So given the fact that those are kind of bipartisan pieces of legislation, we could see something with stablecoin. And I think Senator Lummis is the one to probably kind of be the champion of that. Now that McHenry is retired, I think it's going to switch to the other aisle and be Lummis.
Can I jump in on that? And
Sure.
I know you said you were going to talk about crypto later, but what is the common ground? Because you have states that have, preemptively outlawed CBDC. And you have states that are looking at how do we use this in government. Where did Congress meet on bipartisan support?
I think a lot of this actually gets back to the privacy issues, where Congress realizes that having 50 sets of laws is not as conducive to having an overarching federal policy on this. And then the states can do with it whatever they want within the groundwork of the federal policy. So I think that's probably the key. I also will tell you, I know I mentioned CBDC, unless Congress forces the Federal Reserve to act on CBDC, they're not going to. So I think that that's probably something way down the road, if at all. So let me touch on real quick now the House Financial Services Committee. I don't know why I can't say that today. And the House of Representatives. So again, we've got the Republicans still in charge. It looks like now it's going to be about a 5 or 6 seat majority. I believe there are 3 races that are still not yet called. And with Congressman McHenry retiring, and by the way, he was a big fintech type champion, so that is a big loss for at least a knowledge base on that committee for the crypto industry coming in that's very eager to make changes and do things. But the three candidates to run that committee, and I believe that's going to be decided either the week directly after the Thanksgiving break or the week after that. So we'll know before mid-December. Congressman Hill from Arkansas, Congressman Huizenga from Michigan, or Congressman Barr from Kentucky. Here's the good news. I think Hill has got the inside track right now, French Hill from Arkansas. French Hill is a huge friend of the ACH network and of what Nacha and our members and payment associations are doing. I, without a doubt, will say the most knowledgeable member in Congress on ACH and the benefits of ACH, and has advocated for ACH. On the Senate side, it is likely Senator Lummis, so that's a good sign too, that the network is in pretty good hands with those folks, with, in Lummis's case, rising up to power, and in Hill's case, perhaps taking over the chair of a very powerful committee. The other thing that makes me feel good or makes me sleep at night is Congressman Huizenga is very similar, knows the network, not as strong as Hill, maybe isn't quite as passionate, but really understands the network and the value of the network, as does Congressman Barr. So however that shakes out, we're in pretty good hands. But for example, with Congressman Hill, a couple of kind of inside policy scoop things would be, he is actually on his own reached across not only the aisle in the House of Representatives to Democrats, but getting bicameral support by going across the Capitol to the other side and getting bipartisan Senate support for a letter to the Federal Reserve several months, well, more, about a half year ago, before the NSS and FedWire policies came out, advocating the Fed to at least take a look at expanding NSS because of the ubiquity of the ACH network and the fact that it served a great value for everyone, payroll, small businesses, and others, and wanted the Fed to at least look at it, and was knowledgeable enough to then acknowledge, not in the letter, but to me, that, hey, we understand that the Fed can expand it. We have to wait on Nacha to actually decide with their members if there's a path forward and what to do. So that was just really, really, I think, great. Whether anything ever comes of it, it's just the fact that we have somebody who understands this. The other great story about Congressman Hill is they called me, I don't know when, let's just say a year ago. And they said, Bill, do you have any strong consumer contacts? And generally you don't think Republican Party, a Southern Republican, and consumers necessarily are the best bedfellows. And I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I've got a couple. I'll do a virtual introduction or set up a call or whatever. Did the introduction, everything went, fine. I didn't know anything more of it. What I found out several months later was he had reached out to these groups and asked them before he ever wrote the letter to the Fed, is ACH and the availability of ACH beyond traditional NSS hours important to you? And emphatically, they said yes. So in just reaching out to not only both chambers of Congress, but also to a group that he isn't normally aligned with, showed me that there's a lot of passion there for promoting the ACH network. And I don't have the guts to ask, is there Walmart behind this or something, being in Arkansas? But I really do think he's just somebody who understands that payments are growing and there are a lot of fantastic payment options, either currently with us or on the horizon. But at the end of the day, sort of your quiet payment network is the ACH network. So I feel pretty good about where we could be headed with some of those people in key leadership positions in the House and in the Senate. If we move on to the White House, and I think that was part of the question, was just looking at the White House, President Trump has now nominated a representative or a candidate for each member of his cabinet and has filled many, but not all. It'll take months to fill all of sort of the internal White House positions. This weekend, we had one of the final cabinet nominees come out, Scott, I believe it's a Bessent. And Scott he's with Key Square Capital Management Group, and he is kind of an unknown in Washington. Has supported Donald Trump since the 2016 election, but has really stayed away from Washington, has just sort of quietly led the Key Square Capital Management Group, which is also, I don't think, overly political. So I had to do some digging over the weekend to prepare not only for this podcast, but just to work with our industry or colleagues and our membership on what we can expect from this close advisor to now the president-elect, Donald Trump. A couple of things that are a little bit kind of bigger picture that I came up with is he feels that the deficit has to be around 3%. So that's a serious, significant trimming of the deficit. Now, before he was nominated, he had a quote and thought that the deficit of 3% of the gross domestic product should try to be achieved by 2028. So I don't think we're at least looking at immediate cuts or anything crazy along those lines. And that would achieve a 3%, what he called a real economic growth. So nothing inflated, nothing doctored. A couple other things that at least made me feel better as an older gentleman who is nearing retirement age in a couple of years. He has said repeatedly that no entitlements should be touched. That Social Security, Medicare should stay I'm saying exactly as is, but there should not be any cuts or any significant changes to those entitlement programs in his view, which I'm hoping is, again, somebody nearing retirement happens to be true. He is a big corporate tax cut guy, though. Definitely plays to the Fortune 500 type. And I would imagine that's another thing that was appealing to the president-elect. He also was quoted during the election season, for lack of a better term, that he thinks that the tariffs need to be gradually layered in, that you can't just go all tariff. And he also suggested, and I think this has been said before by others, that maybe the tariffs are just sort of the hammer needed to negotiate with other countries on other solutions that might be more favorable than a tariff. So the threat of a tariff may be really the benefit, not the tariff itself. I think that a couple things that I need to do a little more digging on, but I found that were interesting about the candidate. And again, the Secretary of Treasury is going to have a very loud, large voice in our industry, that they thought that nominating a shadow chair of the Federal Reserve that could help guide monetary policy without actually holding a formal position within the Federal Reserve. So I was kind of looking at that. It would be beneficial. First of all, let me finish that thought. So I'm kind of thinking of just somebody who is sort of the voice of the president and of the Treasury, perhaps some of the other agencies, is just there to advise Governor Powell and the other governors. But I think we need to learn a little bit more about that. He also appears not to be a big Governor Powell fan. But just as a quick civics lesson, the Federal Reserve they are elected to terms, or they're appointed to terms. So the president can't just arbitrarily fire Governor Powell. It also, doing some research, doing some digging, it remains very murky whether or not we know he can't fire Powell, if he could even ask Powell to step down as chairman. I've read some commentary that say that's within the purview of the presidency. I've read others that say it's not. And quite honestly, I think if he tried and it was litigated, the litigation would go on past 2026 anyway. Mm-hmm. And Powell was the chairman in the previous Trump administration. And, at least according to him, and I think many of us would agree, the economy was good. I mean, so I think he sticks with Jay Powell. I don't know if he really has a choice. The other thing, and this is going to kind of get into my next point, that I thought was really interesting is he is a crypto fan. He was even quoted as saying that he is a big, and the word I think was believer, but I'm not sure about that, but something that told me that maybe he really didn't think Bitcoin was as great as it is, but he liked Bitcoin because it got young people involved in the market. And he feels that in order to grow the market, this is a very valuable participant group that has largely been ignored or is largely kind of set out in the past. And he thinks that that's going to cultivate a strong culture in the U.S. stock market. And he believes that if they can go beyond kind of crypto investing and buying crypto type currencies, they'll understand that this system is the capitalism, or is the centerpiece of capitalism, and helps and benefits everybody. So I thought that was kind of an interesting take, and I'm kind of hoping he's asked about that whenever his confirmation hearing comes up. And And by the way, and I'll touch on potential confirmations without getting too political, I think he is pretty much a shoo-in to be confirmed. I don't think Dems are going to necessarily love him because of the tax cutting and the big business love affair, but I think they'll see enough positives in him with Social Security and Medicare and maybe tamping down expectations on tariffs that eventually they will confirm him. I don't think that's going to be a contentious confirmation. So that is a little bit of the very new scoop as we're recording this the Monday after he was announced as the nominee by President Trump. I think that there are, just as we get to confirmations, there are going to be a couple of confirmations that are going to be very difficult for the president to get through. I know some have been even head scratchers within his own party. I think that we saw already Matt Gaetz withdraw his name as the potential attorney general, and the former attorney general of Florida has been nominated in his place. I believe her name is Bondi. But I think that maybe Tulsi Gabbard and maybe Robert Kennedy are going to have and Hegseth, the Department of Defense, might have tough sledding, but a lot of that remains to be seen. It's very rare that incoming president has many of their cabinet choices rebuked, but I think that all three of these have enough red flags that at least there'll be a lot of scrutiny and a lot of angst by not only the entire Democratic Party, but several moderate Republicans. And I know that over the weekend, we had, I believe it was Senator Murkowski of Alaska even say that if the president's nominees don't go through the proper background checks with the FBI and not private background services hired by the incoming administration, that she wouldn't approve of any of them. But I'm sure they're going to come to some sort of agreement on that. That might have been political posturing for the Sunday morning talk shows.
Can I ask a question on that?
Sure, absolutely.
It's not trying to not be political. Let's take the Fox host, because I will butcher his name if I say it. Let's take the Fox host for an example, and you've been through a few elections with this. Seems for me personally, seems that he hasn't been in a position where he's just managed as many people as he would have to manage in the new position. From a learning curve perspective, do they face trouble once they're in the position, just getting up to speed or getting everything moving?
I would think that's a very difficult task. And yes, worked on the weekends, talking about the military, talking about all things policy related. But again, I talk about politics. I don't think I could become the chair of the Senate Banking Committee. I think there are going to be a lot of things thrown at them that are going to be very difficult. I don't know all of his background. I know that within the military, he did not have strong leadership positions. And there's a sexual assault allegation hanging out there that, again, folks that he's met with on the Hill, J.D. Vance brought him up to the Hill last week, say that they're perfectly satisfied with his answers and they're going to move forward. I'm just not sure if all 53 Republican senators feel that way. And really all they have to do is if 4 defect, the nomination is done. Now, again, quick civics lesson. If 3 defect and it's a 50-50 tie, J.D. Vance's vice president breaks the tie, the nominee goes through. But will be very interesting. And I do think the lack of experience will trouble some, as I know just as a citizen, it's troubling to me. The other thing I wanted to kind of get to here, beyond more politics, is late last week, I think it was probably Thursday, but it doesn't really matter, the White House announced that they were seriously considering appointing a crypto czar. And I think it's a great idea. I don't have a problem with the idea. And just to remind folks, because I had to go back and think like, wow, has this ever been done before? How's this going to work? But the Obama administration, one of the first things he did, I believe, was appoint a technology czar. And that was somebody who understood technology and could be a liaison for the government regulators, members of Congress, and even the private sector to a degree to talk about about best practices in technology. So I assume this crypto czar would do the same thing. So probably be a very frequent invited guest for Senate and House hearings, probably work with committee staff on some education, work with the Treasury Secretary and maybe OCC, FDIC, the Fed, to kind of understand use cases for potential cryptocurrency. So I think for that industry, it's a good sign. Now, let me kind of pull back the cover a little bit and explain why I think this is the case. The crypto industry, which has had a strong lobbying presence on the Hill, but hasn't been overly effective with that lobbying presence, put a ton of money into the Trump campaign. Trump rewarded them by doing campaign speeches at high-profile kind of crypto, Bitcoin type events. And I think this is a great way for the administration to kind of pay back, as a lot of the political appointees that have been named so far were big donors or people that raised money to the crypto industry, but also something that will help advance crypto type legislation, policies, or regulations. So I think that they probably will go through with it. They weren't totally committed to it yet, but I suspect that by just this the current incoming administration has been they've been pretty good about being locked down on a lot of things already. For them to publicly announce it tells me that it's well on its way. I then started thinking, okay, do we know anybody in the DC policy circles that could be the crypto czar? And I don't know personally the folks that run the few trade associations in that space, but I think that a name to look out for, and Joe, you've been very supportive of Nacha's government relations advisory group, is at the end of the last Trump presidency, the acting director of the Office of the Comptroller of Currency was Brooks. And I think that Brian Brooks, who spoke to Greg and the Nacha board on a virtual call several months prior to leaving office when Trump left, is a smart guy, and he knows how to get around Washington. I personally think sometimes he's a little too smart of a guy and maybe tunes people out, but he's worked with two different crypto organizations. I think finance is the current one. And honestly, I don't recall the first one since he left office at the OCC. So he's got the knowledge base, he's got the executive kind of training and skills, and he is incredibly intelligent. So if I had to, like you bet on a horse, if I had to bet, I think Brian Brooks could be a good chance to take over that position.
I don't mean this in any negative way. Having joined you on the Hill Day, there are a lot of smart people on the Hill. I mean, just kind of, I consider myself pretty smart. I felt like some of them were dumbing things down just to be accommodating to me. The staffers were, you introduced us to, were just so smart. I wonder where they are today, but just so smart. So I get that comment about being, too smart. I get it.
I will add too, the staffers, when you said, where are they today? A lot of them in associations and think tanks, and they're probably all making more money than you and I. But another just kind of, a weird thing that I think maybe some of the listeners may appreciate is when Joe talks about these staffers being so bright, so driven, they're all incredibly young too.
Yes.
It's unbelievable. I think probably the majority of the people we talk to or work with are under 32, many of them being under 30. So they're smart, driven folks that come out of colleges and universities, get hired, work in these jobs where they learn a lot and they make so many great contacts for 5-6 years and then blow out and make money in the private sector doing very well, or take a pretty significant government leadership position. And with that, and I'm going to admit, I'm going to look at my cheat sheet here because I'm pulling a blank on his name. I wasn't going to really talk about who may end up running the FDIC, but it's a longtime Senate staffer, somebody who's stuck in the Senate, but now could be having huge rewards on it. And that is, Travis Hill. And Joe, we actually met with Travis Hill years ago, but Travis Hill is a longtime Senate aide that knows the banking industry inside and out. And he is the only name so far I've seen mentioned to possibly lead the FDIC. So wow. The reverse of what I just said, the one person that really has stuck around and made a really good name for themselves and really smart could very well become the leader of FDIC. And that would not be the first time in the Trump playbook that the person running FDIC was a longtime Republican Hill aide, because we might remember somebody we met with years ago was Yelena McWilliams, who was Trump's FDIC head in the first term. And Yelena actually met with me before same day ACH was anything more than a concept and said, hey, I'm fascinated by same-day ACH. Tell me more. Tell me the pros and the cons, and tell me where this could slip up. And we had a great conversation one day. I thought it was going to be about a 15-minute meeting, get a little attaboy from her, be sent on my way. We talked for almost an hour.
Wow.
And at one point even, she brought the Democrat counsel, the Democrat lawyer in to the meeting, asked you to send somebody away to see if she was available. And I talked with both of them together because she was more like, I want to make sure that there's nothing that could trip this up, because this is really good for our economy and good for business, government, and consumers. So there's just a little side story that I hardly ever talk. Yep, they're the people you need. So we've talked a little bit about some of these appointments, and I talked earlier that if I was a betting man, I would put my money on Brian Brooks or even a Travis Hill, folks along those lines. I'm going to mention for a second, because this is the one where if I was a betting man, I'd be broke right now. I thought that the entire campaign season, I said in my mind, and I actually said it publicly a few times, but in smaller groups, the only certainty to me was if Trump won re-election and became president in 2024, the director of CFPB would be Brian Johnson. And Joe, you probably remember, Brian spoke to our group within the last year. Brian was the number 2 or the number 3 at CFPB in the first Trump term. He worked on the Hill for Jeb Hensarling, who was the Texas majority leader the last time the Republicans had control of the House. I think going up from like 2012 to 2016 was the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. And Brian was basically tasked when he worked on the Hill to try to undo everything that Director Cordray was doing with CFPB. Mm-hmm. So it is a fan of consumer protection, but not as a fan of over-regulating such. And Brian was the only name throughout the campaign I ever heard. I shouldn't say all, like it's thousands. The dozen or so kind of industry insiders I talked to thought that, and I'm not going to name names. 2 people currently at the CFPB and senior positions both said they expect Brian Johnson to take over CFPB. Well, right after the election and a brief conversation, we were told that by Brian that he doesn't have any interest in going back to the government, and he is going to stay in the private sector.
Wow.
So Brian Johnson will not be running the CFPB. And I think as a result of that, I don't know who's going to be nominated. And I haven't even heard a name yet, which is really surprising, because I would think one of the first people that Trump would like to see replaced is Director Chopra. And I'm not trying to besmirch Director Chopra, but just Director Chopra sort of stands for everything that this re-election of the President Trump, was against. Mm-hmm. So I've got 2 names here that I've heard, or 3 names that I've heard before. One is Jonathan Gould, but Jonathan Gould has also been mentioned as perhaps somebody that will take OCC on. Jonathan Gould, I believe, is a lawyer from Jones Day, I think, which is based out of the Midwest, but offices everywhere, probably even up north, but I know big presence in DC. Or a Todd Zawicki or Jonathan McKernan. And I don't know Todd or Jonathan. So we'll have to kind of stay tuned on CFPB, but I haven't heard a peep yet on what may happen there. So we'll stay tuned on that.
Excellent.
The only other thing I was going to touch on before we talked a little bit about how long in reality the president has to enact all these things that he'd like to enact, is something that is not really well known and has been seldom used by most incoming administrations except for the 2016 Trump administration. And that's called the Congressional Review Act. And the Congressional Review Act allows Congress to look at any regulation that was promulgated within 60 legislative days of the election. And the key there is legislative days. So if Congress breaks, adjourns for a recess, for, let's just say for re-election season or for the July 4th holiday, for Thanksgiving, whatever, those aren't considered legislative days. So it's a kind of a tough calendar to go back and figure out, but the best I can tell, it goes back to at least August, because there was so much time off for the House to run their elections and a third of the Senate to run for re-election. So there are a lot of regulations that could be undone. Now, I don't think a lot of them will be financial related, so we don't need to hark on this too much. I think if I had to pick one, again, let's just get back to the had to throw money one way or the other. I think the CFPB credit card late rule could potentially be undone. And for those of you out there that are screaming at the computer right now saying, 1033, can they but don't undo the larger participant rule that CFPB put out last week. I think a couple of twists and turns there. One, within seconds of 1033 coming out, two of the larger industry trades filed a lawsuit in Texas. I think they'd rather wait for that litigation to take place. And I can almost guarantee no matter which side loses that litigation, the other side, they will appeal. So this thing isn't going to be resolved for a long time. And people that are much smarter than me seem to think there's an excellent chance that the industry might win that court case.
What's the objection? I mean, this is open banking or no?
Yeah, it's open banking. And the objection, a lot of it has to do with CFPB expanding beyond their scope, beyond what they're actually allowed to do. I think some of the other arguments, but I'm not sure they're legal arguments, would be who's assuring the consumers whose data is being accessed that data is safe, that data won't be used for ill gain. I think those are some of the other things. But I really think the crux of the lawsuit revolves around CFPB overstepping their regulatory boundaries. And I don't think most of your financial institution members on the call want the larger participant rule overturned. I also think at some point we'll see a lawsuit on that, and it could be very similar to 1033. So I don't think the new administration is going to touch either one of those. I think they're going to touch a lot of more energy related things, environmental related things that don't really pertain specifically to our industry. But it will be interesting to see what the Republican-led House and Senate do on that to undo some of the things of the previous 4 year in the Biden administration.
Yeah, question on that, and I probably barely remember this correctly, but last administration for Trump, I thought there was a rule or a policy that for every new piece of legislation, they needed to delete or expire 2 pieces of legislation or regs or something.
Joe, I recall it. I don't think it was a hard and fast rule because I don't ever recall like specific scenarios on it. I do think, though, again, if you look at the platform, particularly kind of the MAGA platform, it was to reduce government influence on companies and individuals. So I think that is possible. I think we'll see a lot more, though, in the environmental and energy space than we will maybe financial policies. Because in some cases, as much as banks were upset about certain regulations, they've now paid for them and implemented them. So I'm not sure if it really is that beneficial for banks to have to undo them. But again, I'm not inside bank boardrooms.
Sure.
Where I was going to end with this is particularly out there for those of you that might have been disappointed in the election results. Keep in mind a couple of things. One, the House of Representatives is up for re-election every 2 years. So the entire 435 members of Congress will be up for re-election in 2026. Over the history, the current presidential party in the White House, so as of January 20th, the Republicans lose seats in the midterm elections. So you'll probably see the House flip, and the House will flip Democrats, which will remove at least the 3-chamber control in the legislative process. In the Senate, with a 53 to 47 majority, it might be hard for the Democrats to flip the Senate, but here's what I will tell you. This past election, and it was just a weird thing, more of the senators up for re-election were Democrats, and they were Democrats that were in states that supported Trump in the 2016 election. Well, the pendulum is now swung. In 2026, 2/3 of the senators that are up for re-election are Republican, and about half of those are in states that either supported Biden or what I would call purple states, states that have gone either way, or they might still be Republican or red states, but they're trending more and more blue every election cycle. So It is possible the Democrats could take back the Senate. I don't think they will, but I think they'll close the margin on the Senate, which makes it Very interesting. And then you could even go 2 years further out. Then the senators that are running in 2028 with a closer margin have to then start appealing to their base. And if their base is a little bit more moderate or Democrat, you might see some Republicans side with Democrats, like we saw Senator Manchin of West Virginia side with Republicans many times during the Biden administration. So the final thing on that is not only is there an election in 2026, but you've got the inauguration on January 20th. You have to have all the hearings to get the cabinet members in place. You've got to get the White House personnel in place, which should be a little faster, but still they need to get up to speed. They need to kind of formulate a game plan. We know almost for a fact that the first thing the president is going to work on is immigration, and then tax reform. And last, we still don't have a 2025 budget. So there's going to have to be a budget passed. Right now, we're acting under a continuing budget resolution, and likely they will pass another one because I think the Republicans would rather have all their people in place in 2025 than trying to come up with a budget in the lame duck session of this Congress. So there'll be a continuing budget resolution likely to like March 30th or something, and they have to come up with a budget. And I'm sure the president wants his fingerprint on that budget. So 3 Herculean tasks that are the top priorities for the administration probably have to be done before they really start considering or pushing for anything else.
Excellent.
Then usually about 6 to 9 months before the reelection season, Congress really starts to kind of shut down because all those members need to get back to their districts and run for reelection. So I haven't really done the math, but it's probably about 16 months of, kind of pure joy of having Republicans in the House, the Senate, your full staff in the White House, your cabinet people there, and the president accomplishing the top 3 priorities in the first 100 days or whatever, and then moving forward with other priorities. So I don't think that some of these things that folks have been fearful of will come to fruition. I just don't have a crystal ball, and I can't tell you which one of those things.
Sure. But I did notice that none of those were new regulations or in new enforcement on existing regulations. So
right, unless they kill off a regulation and then have a thin layered regulation to replace it or something. Yes. Right. So the good thing for me is I'm not going to be filing a lot of comment letters to Treasury, the Federal Reserve, OCC or FDIC supporting or not supporting whatever reg they propose. So that'll take the pressure off of me having to write lots of comment letters. So we'll see. But I know those are the 3 things you wanted to cover today, Joe, but are there any other questions while we're having this conversation?
No, I mean, the only other things is I just had a comment on crypto, it's really interesting. Crypto is a gigantic topic. I think it's really interesting that it started as sort of a way to bypass the government and the system. And now they're trying to work it into a system. It just seems diametrically opposed from its roots. And then the other thing is, what was the other thing? The other thing was, it was a civics lesson, Civics 101. I know the House is up every 2 years. How much of the Senate is up every 2? Because they have 6-year terms.
Yeah, so 1/3 of the Senate every 2 years.
Okay.
So I didn't say it because I didn't want to confuse people, but of the 1/3 of the Senate up for re-election, 2/3 of that 1/3 is Republican. That was a mouthful for me. That's why I kind of avoided saying it that way. But yeah, that's it. And on the crypto thing, if you go back to one of the earlier comments, that's one of the reasons why I think the Senate Banking Committee is going to take anti-money laundering so seriously is they've got to make sure that whatever is being promoted in the crypto space isn't going to hurt, with terrorism or with illicit money going cross-border or changing hands. And they need to be certain that those things are kind of clamped down as we start growing different payment options and payment vehicles.
Yeah, fascinating, really fascinating. That we could spend probably multiple episodes on crypto all by itself. That's all I had. I do want to thank you for what you do, not even for being on the podcast. Keeping track of all the motions up on the Hill is pretty amazing. I can sit and listen. This podcast was pretty much me listening, which I'm happy to do. I could listen to you all day because it's fascinating, the intricacies of government. So thank you.
Oh, Joe, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. And whenever you'd like me back, just consider it. If it's an open invitation, it's an open accept. So
Excellent. And it is. So thank you very much. Thanks
Awesome.
for joining me. If you had comments, let me know.
okay, happy holidays, guys.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
On behalf of NEACH, your trusted resource in payments, and our guests, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning into the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to hear more about payments innovation and modernization, you can find the Wrestling Payments Podcast on the podcast page of NEACH.org or wherever you subscribe to podcasts. Just search for Wrestling Payments in your podcast app. Thanks for listening.